Terrific. So for this final session of the day, we're going to be talking a little bit about what are the correct goals to ensure a more appropriate use of technology to optimize the clinical trials enterprise. And it was interesting as just to give you some backstory on this particular conversation, we put a lot of thought into the language for this session and exactly what it was we were trying to optimize. And it was really important to us as a sort of planning committee that we didn't take a stance of tech determinism. There were a couple of early iterations where it sounded like what we wanted to do was sort of throw tech at every single problem, and that tech was going to be sort of the silver bullet solution. And it was really important to us not to take that stance, but rather realize that in addition to all of the other critically important things we've discussed today, tech was another and newer tool in the toolbox to help us really create a more inclusive, a more resilient clinical trials enterprise. So I wanted to give you that backstory because I think, or I hope it will be helpful in scoping our conversation today. So again, our focus will be on ensuring a more appropriate use of technology to optimize the clinical trials enterprise. And let me do a couple of things. I'll throw down for discussion some of the potential goals that the planning committee came up with, and I'm curious to hear you guys react to those, and also let me know what we may have missed and what feels out of place. So very broadly, movement towards decentralizing clinical trials, and I think there's a lot of ways we can dig into that if that piques your interest. The use of digital tools for clinical trials management, including the development of resources to help institutions that need more support. Another potential goal could be to increase local capacity for research innovation, to collate efforts to frame new technologies as part of an ecosystem rather than as a series of one-off sort of pilots or a patchwork of tech solutions, to develop and deploy systems and tools to combine many sources of data, that we could use technology to incorporate patient input into research. That could actually be a tool to help us there. And the final list for us, or the final potential goal on the list for us to discuss would be to advance the use of analytics for recruitment and analysis. I think that list gives a really good sense of the breadth of what we could potentially even mean when we talk about technologies, from hardware solutions to platforms to analytics. So let me stop there and see what immediately jumps out as being particularly important or potentially something that we should take care not to focus too greatly on.
So Jen, maybe I could also throw out an idea about we may not have been able to finish some discussions on some of the other points from the other breakouts.
Yep.
Specifically for me, transparency. I think that could relate to a bunch of the technology-driven issues here. And could be potential ways to help improve things like trust in the system, seeing data that isn't being seen right now, that could answer questions as to why we get the results we get out of these clinical trials, why sometimes they're surprising from an inclusion standpoint, and perhaps how there may be technologies that we could start to think about that could help with the transparency issue. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, Chris, this is Silas. I would agree that, and transparency drives trust. And when data can be shared back with communities, specifically through trusted community-facing organizations that need to be engaged in this process, they can then use some of that data to actually improve their own asks of local funding sources, right? Many times what happens now is they're asked to participate in the support of some sort of outreach and engagement around a clinical trial, or whoever has the NIH grant or Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant of the moment. All sorts of data is collected, de-identified, aggregated, and mined in various ways, but none of that tends to be shared back with these community-facing organizations that have been asked to participate in hindsight almost. And because that data is not shared, particularly in a lay format, it's not useful to them. And once again, they just kind of feel used as part of this process and discarded until the next payer, provider, government, or academic stakeholder with the next grant comes knocking on their door, and it hasn't been working very well at the community level.
And can I add that it's not just sharing back, but it's the informed consent, the knowledge that it's even happening, that I think is part of, there's a real tension here between developing some of these technologies to make it easy and the ability of people to be aware that it is happening and that it's happening for a purpose that they may agree with, but it's not, there's little opportunity to explain that to people.
And again, I guess I like the goal that you spoke about resource development, because I don't think all communities are on the same level playing field. And so as long as there's some investment in developing those resources that are there, and then as a practitioner, I'm having some questions or querying when we're reporting back and it's transparent to the community that you've engaged to get to participate, but individually, how are we protecting the individual information, notwithstanding the HIPAA requirements, but I see there certainly getting information back to the community engages, but I worry about the individual that may have signed a consent to give some of the information, but not truly understanding it. And so how do we make sure that that is protected as well?
Can I just ask, when you talk about resource development, exactly what you're referring to?
Is that for me?
Clarify. Yes, to you. Thank you.
Well, from my standpoint, I was looking at the goal that was just mentioned. And of course, I looked at that resource development as those making sure that they have internet access, or if you're going to use some other digital technology, that it's available and useful for that community group as well as individuals within that particular society.
Thank you.
Now, again, Jan may have had something different.
I will. I have some thoughts that won't surprise anyone, but I want to make sure that we're also paying attention to folks who are dialing in externally. So I'm going to answer that question. I'm not dodging it, but let me first give voice to a question from Deborah Collier, who asks, "What's in it for patients? What will each person and/or participant and/or trial person, patient, or trial participant get out of the technology themselves?" It's one more way just to get or take more data from patients with the way it's normally discussed. And I think we're starting to tease that out a little bit. And the people we're getting data from need to get something out of it too, all along the way. Curious if anyone has any reactions to that.
I think that the comment that an earlier speaker made about transparency driving trust and sharing data back to the communities is very important in that regard.
I think there's a general underappreciation for the role of communication and marketing, in essence, in this whole enterprise, that's an important part of a lot of commercial enterprises. And I think we don't use the power of it in some of these, clinical trial related activities that we do, especially in academics.
Yeah. If I could just chime in real quick, Rob Califf mentioned, a gamification aspect. So for an individual community member, perhaps there's an opportunity to participate for more than what heretofore has been, a ham sandwich, right? Give us your data and we'll buy you lunch. You get a ham sandwich. And for community-facing organizations, certainly the cake is already baked by the time the clinical trial enterprise is knocking on their door, asking for trusted access to community members. There's been no co-create. I don't want to say there's been no, but rarely is there co-creation of a campaign to engage community. And very rarely are these community-facing organizations factored into the budget. They're many times just asked to participate. Don't you care about your community? Well, certainly we care about our community, but the pastor also has a light bill, a water bill, and a gas bill, and you've got a $2 million NIH grant. So where's the equity there? So I agree with the caller.
These are so Deborah, first of all, thank you for a terrific question. You've seeded some wonderful discussion here. Doris, I'm going to go full circle on and answer the questions from you and Celia, which is, when we talk about resources, it's funny. I thought when Rob was just presenting and he showed the slide with the fork in the road, I thought he was going to take that in a different direction. And I thought he was going to take it in a way in which I do sometimes, which is, are we going to use these digital technologies as a weapon or a tool? And I have a bit of a flair for the dramatic, but I really think that is the juncture that we're at right now. Are we going to use them to go in and double down on the way that we mine communities for data, take it, and then don't return either the information or oftentimes even a subsequent medical product back to those very same communities? Or are we going to use these as a new tool in the toolbox to say, actually, we can make it easier to share this back with you. We can make it less burdensome for you to participate. We can make it easier to do things like a sort of app-based informed consent that really checks and gives you all of the tiered learning you need to truly understand how we use this information. And I think it comes back to an intentionality in how we deploy these things and whether we exacerbate the existing challenges, particularly around how we sort of go into communities, or whether we actually use them to sort of ameliorate those things. And I don't know I don't think there's a silver bullet to get it right, but I think we just need to be eyes wide open and intentional every single step of the way and looking to do the best possible, not the bare minimum every time we think about using a technology. I'm curious, one of the things that Rob set up a little bit was talking about sort of what I would describe as data rights and data governance. I think he selected words like sort of, privacy. I prefer not to use privacy, and I'll tell you why. And then I want you all to react to this, because I think this might help us set some goals. We can keep everything for private if we keep it in a manila folder in a locked filing cabinet, but it's not going to do anyone very much good. Lynn, you made a really good point about informed consent and getting that right and making sure that we really are doing sort of thoughtful education, but also allowing people to opt in and opt out and really be individual in how they share their data. How, in an era when things are absolutely no longer locked in a filing cabinet in an investigator's office, right? How do we make sure that we are setting standards and mechanisms to allow the flow of data so that we can do things like have a learning healthcare system, we can do better medical product development, but we are not risking anyone's privacy or safety in doing any of this? I wonder what folks think about how we should set our goals there.
One of the things that I think about, that's very important, but I particularly if you're setting standards, you want to make sure that those standards are based upon a diverse use of the technology. And I say that when we start to think about some of the AI tools and even the pulse ox that I was just reading an article about the standard of when do you need to add oxygen based upon the standard that was set, and that standard, it does not have the diversity that's necessary. So you are under-reading certain populations. And so I think that as we develop the digital tools, make sure that there's diversity included in the standardization so that it is useful across the board.
Doris, I'm really glad you brought that up. I've got some colleagues who I work with who run an academic lab, and they do things like test how pulse ox and sort of heart rate monitoring performs across different skin tones. And I mean, they're on the brink of collapse. There isn't a funding mechanism to fund that kind of research right now. And I actually think it's some of the most important questions we need to be asking. Again, the sort of fork in the road, right? Are we going to double down on the health inequities we've seen because we allow it to go unchecked as we add in a whole new slew of tools and resources? Or do we actually say, you know what, this means that if you don't live around the corner from a specialist, we can still do high quality sort of monitoring and outreach as needed. And I go back to, and it's perhaps emerging as a theme, but correct me if I'm overstating here, you know, the correct incentives to make sure that we have an evidence base for doing all of this, a funding mechanism to support the generation of that evidence, and then checks and balances if it's not happening.
I was thinking that was part of what you mentioned in terms of resources, and putting that in that category. And certainly it's more than telling the person you're going to give them a dinner or transportation to a center. I think the participant is much more valuable than that. And if you have that $2 million grant from XYZ, you want to make sure that the key part of what you're getting at is also valued. And that's part of the transparency and openness with information sharing.
How do we think about, one of the potential goals that was included here was to begin using advanced analytics, for example, for recruitment and analysis. That seemed like a terribly good idea at the time of planning, but I'm having second thoughts about it as a consequence of our conversations today, because it seems to me that if that's the approach you're going to use, the hard to reach patients aren't going to be in the existing databases that you're searching, right? They aren't going to, that population is going to be limited in your EHR. It's the people who we always see in the trials who are going to have, you know, a high presence in these existing EHRs and these existing databases. It seems to me that actually that's a goal we may want to pause and consider a little bit more carefully in the light of some of the conversations today, if we really are serious about engaging communities who we know are sort of hard to reach generally in every aspect of healthcare, whether it's research or actual sort of care delivery. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts or if I've oversimplified that. Chris, I saw you nodding, so I'm going to call on you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I was just thinking. I was actually going to prompt you to ask Dr. Levy, you know, Dr. Siegel, and Dr. Collier, because one of the things that I think one of the speakers mentioned was the issue of regulation. So, you know, certain conversations are prohibited, certain ways that you could get data that could really find those patients that could benefit, that are from underrepresented groups. Well, are you truly allowed to do that, given the kind of restrictions that are often placed on that kind of what would be classically called data mining? From my perspective, it would behoove us to think about ways to streamline and make more efficient those systems that we're finding as roadblocks to doing a better job with identifying patients in need.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, to the question of whether use of analytic tools will continue to bias against harder to reach groups, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, but it's not a reason not to use those tools. It's a reason to use those tools with the appropriate controls and intent, because you can also use them to select certain populations that are otherwise very hard to find or very rare, and you can accompany their use with efforts to ensure that you do have access to a broader population. I'm not sure what the question was that you were directing in part to me about data mining in terms of patient identification.
I think it's more, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but it was more just the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in, and to be able to unlock or unleash what we could find in that data, but being sure that we're cognizant of all of the rules and regulations as far as keeping the clinical trial data.
Yeah, so I was 20 years at the FDA and as long in industry, and I would say that those sorts of rules are in place to limit claims that a pharmaceutical company might make through exploratory post-hoc analysis of databases that's not hypothesis driven. And that's an appropriate and important limitation, because you can jump to many excessive conclusions if you're not careful, or inappropriate conclusions. But that said, there's no limitation on the use of those data to learn things, to generate hypotheses for future study. And for many types of analysis, including particularly analysis by critical demographic subgroups, there are regulations in place that specifically allow and even support those uses. So I don't think there's a lot of regulatory impediments to the use of data in that manner.
Just a comment that social media has really revolutionized our ability to reach rare populations, because so many of them have advocacy groups now and patient groups. And of course, that's only the beginning. Then you have to establish a respectful relationship. And we do a variety of things, including town halls that are really patient-driven, in which we provide scientific information, but also make sure that there are always presentations by the patients themselves so that their voice is heard. And then from that, they're much more likely to want to engage in identifying the questions that are of concern to that community. And that then can lend itself to a very, very good relationship in terms of deciding what should be the next protocol and how to do it in a way that's going to be most appropriate for the community.
Barry, you've given some terrific examples through the course of the day. I wonder if one of the things we should be considering is, how do we drive the dissemination of those sorts of practices, right? You've had a couple of lovely examples around how you've been able to construct sort of opportunities and systems for better practice. Adrian as well earlier was able to give some from Duke. How do we stop these from being, one of the goals I think here was to stop a sort of patchwork of one-off good technologies. How do we stop a patchwork of one-off good initiatives and drive the dissemination of that so it becomes sort of global best practice?
To just say, Adrian has done a fantastic job at Duke. I'm very familiar with a lot of the things that he's done there, so he should definitely chime in here. I'll just comment that one of the goals of the Clinical and Translational Science Award Program is just this dissemination. And if you go to click CLIC, you will see that virtually every CTSA has put up there things related to their programs that they very much want to disseminate. So I think the CTSA program, obviously there are many other ways to think about this, but it is definitely charged with developing best practices and then disseminating them more broadly. So I think that just one thing, I just came off co-chairing the steering committee of the CTSA, the National CTSA Steering Committee, and we, by the end of December, had submitted 14 different papers or manuscripts, I should say, to the journal Clinical and Translational Science that captures different things that were done at CTSAs during this first year of the COVID pandemic, as a way of both describing what people devolved into in terms of best practices, and then the co-editors of the theme issue into which this will go, and I then wrote a summary manuscript putting all of that together with a big table of what to do now and getting prepared. If that ever gets accepted and sees the light of day, that will be another way in which we're trying to disseminate what we've learned in best practices.
That's fantastic, Barry. And I say this with the voice of the battered, bruised experience of how hard dissemination is. That's terrific. I mean, I also know, as you said, see the light of day. That's going to take time. All of this takes time. We're here with a 10-year timeline, but I mean, none of this can really wait. And how do we think about getting the resources out and communicating using the gold standard, which of course is peer review, but also packaging up resources and toolkits and making it accessible and relevant in a way that all of the members of the community who we need to be accessing this can do so easily and comfortably. We've got just a minute left. We touched a lot, and I'm really glad, Chris, you connected the dots between the themes that have run through the day and that technology is not an entity in and of itself. And actually, I think that's one of the goals that we came up with, this idea that, framing technologies as part of the ecosystem. And I say all of that looking around in our group and knowing that there aren't any technologists on the line. So, as we start to host these sorts of discussions and events, it can't be like, oh, we'll brief them on what we need afterwards, right? We need to get much better at accepting new sorts of colleagues here. All right, we're not going to be last back. Celia, thank you for being really wonderful and being willing to give voice to this discussion once again. And also, this is our last breakout for the day. It's been an absolute privilege to get to know you guys, and what tremendous discussions. Really, really appreciate your attention, your expertise, and lovely to get to know you a bit better. So we'll see you back in the main room in just a second.
Thank you.